Welcome to part 2 of The Butcher of Kansas City, Robert Berdella. Thank you to everyone who watches and comments. Now, let's return to the blood-stained home of Robert Berdella for the final 3 murders and the conclusion of this creature's story. By mid-1985, Robert Berdella had tortured 3 young men to death and was ready for his next victim. On September 26th, another of the troubled young men who were acquainted with the monster reached out to him for a place to stay. He met 25-year-old James Ferris at a local bar and took him home. He used crushed tranquilizers to render Ferris unconscious and tied him to his bed. Berdella electrocuted the young man and stuck needles into his neck and groin. Over the next day, he tortured Ferris and violated him repeatedly until he could no longer sit up. Soon, his breathing became labored, and he eventually died of his injuries that day. The monster would not kill again until 1986. On June 17th, he encountered a former lodger at a downtown park. He offered 23-year-old Todd Stoops drug money and lunch, and the two headed back to his home. Over the next 2 weeks, Stoops would endure unimaginable physical and psychological torture at the hands of his captor. Berdella used similar methods as he had with prior victims to deprive Stoops of his senses, but also injected drain cleaner into his larynx to prevent him from screaming. After almost 2 weeks of torture and abuse, Berdella used his fist to violate Stoops, and it led to internal rupturing. On July 1st, Stoops died of septic shock. It was almost a year before Berdella would kill again. On June 23, 1987, 20-year-old Larry Wayne Pearson entered Bob's Bazaar and the two began talking, and Berdella invited him to stay at his house. The killer claims that he initially did not intend to murder Pearson, but changed his mind after bailing him out of jail. The 20-year-old joked about having robbed gay men. Berdella plied Pearson with alcohol and drugs, then suspended him by his hands in the basement. Once again, he tortured his victim for an extended period of time, including smashing one of his hands with a metal pole. After several days, Pearson grew compliant with his captor and followed his orders to avoid further pain. As a result, he was allowed to move out of the basement and into a bedroom. However, as Berdella continued violating Pearson, he eventually lashed out against his captor. After 6 weeks of violence and abuse, the 20-year-old bit Berdella while he was being forced to service the monster. Robert reacted by beating him unconscious with a wooden club, then suffocating him. Once Stoops was dead, Berdella dismembered the body and disposed of it. He briefly kept the head in his freezer before burying it in his yard. The final person to be brought into Berdella's House of Horrors was 22-year-old prostitute Christopher Bryson. On March 29, 1988, Berdella brought him home and the pattern of torture and abuse began once again. After 3 days of suffering, Bryson saw a chance to escape. While Berdella was at work, he used a book of matches to burn through his restraints. Bryson then fled the house wearing only a dog collar. A nearby homeowner called the police and they quickly arrived. 2 officers watched the house waiting for Berdella to return while a warrant was obtained. Bryson told investigators that his captor had shown him photos of what looked to be dead men, which in addition to his injuries made the search warrant more important. Once they were inside Berdella's home, police found evidence of the torture and imprisonment that had taken place there. They found an electrical transformer and cables which were laying near a bed, drugs, syringes, and restraints, as well as worn bedposts from where the ropes had been tied. On the second floor, they found the burned ropes that Bryson had escaped from. They also found 2 skulls, one in the house and one in the yard. A chainsaw was found in the basement stained with blood and meat. Other bones were discovered with marks from where the knives and chainsaw had cut into them. Luminol testing revealed a huge amount of bloodstains around the house and basement, and there were also more than 300 Polaroids depicting the horrific torture Berdella had put his victims through, and these photos were reinforced by detailed notes found in a drawer. Police interviewed various acquaintances of Berdella as they built a case against him. They had found Ferris's wallet in his home and knew he was a suspect in the Howell disappearance. James Ferris's wife had also confirmed that it was him in some of the photographs discovered. As the photographer was visible in some of the Polaroids, investigators examined Berdella to verify that he was the man behind the murders. Investigators were also able to find some of the surviving men whose names were recorded in the torture logs. They told police about the suspect, including that he liked to drug and abuse those he picked up or who stayed at his home. One of the survivors was able to identify some of the individuals in the photographs. By checking records, police discovered that Berdella had bailed Pearson out of jail, which was the last time anyone had heard from him. The killer had also had the nerve to file a police report from the hospital where he was treated for the bite wound that he had sustained from Pearson. When confronted with the evidence that investigators had compiled, Berdella invoked his right to remain silent. Meanwhile, dental records had confirmed that one of the skulls found was that of
Larry Wayne Pearson.
This was the strongest case against Berdella and the first that he received charges for. On July 22, 1988, Robert Berdella was indicted for the murder of Larry Wayne Pearson. A month into the trial, Berdella changed his plea to guilty and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. On August 24th, he pled guilty for the assaults that he had committed against Christopher Bryson, as well as illegally restraining him. For the assaults, he received another life sentence and an additional 7 years for holding Bryson captive. When facing the other 5 murder charges, the monster pled not guilty, but after some legal wrangling from his lawyers, he switched his plea to guilty to avoid the death penalty. He also gave an extended confession detailing every atrocity he had committed over the preceding 4 years, as well as where he had put the bodies of his victims. From December 13th to December 15th, Berdella described every act of evil he had perpetuated against the 6 men that he had killed. He also explained the meaning of some of the abbreviations in the torture logs. Rumors had spread that the bones he had kept were to be sold in his shop, but Berdella strongly denied these claims. A few days after the confession, the killer waived his right to additional trials for each murder. He was sentenced by Judge Robert Myers to 5 more life sentences. Berdella would be locked in Missouri State Penitentiary until his death on October 8, 1992, of a heart attack.